Welcome to Generation Climate, the race to save 1.5. If you felt the searing heat of an unexpected summer, witnessed unprecedented floods, or heard about disappearing ecosystems, then you've already seen the effects of a warming world. For the first time in recorded history, our planet recently exceeded a critical warming threshold, 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels for 12 consecutive months. The consequences are already unfolding across the globe. More intense heat waves, devastating floods, and rapidly changing ecosystems. The question now is, can we act fast enough to avert catastrophe? My name's Ade Adepitan. I'm your host today, and I will be joined by a range of experts and activists on the front lines of the climate crisis. Together, we'll explore their unique perspectives on the race to save 1.5. So CCAG's latest report paints a stark picture of the challenges that we face, viewed through the lens of 4 very different countries: the US, Ghana, India, and Brazil. In this episode, we'll be focusing on the US, India, and Brazil, but we'll dedicate a future episode entirely to Ghana's unique climate challenges. Now, while we have many technological solutions, the true roadblocks remain political, economic, and frankly, human complacency. But there is hope. Progress is possible, and global opinion has shifted dramatically. Recent studies show that the majority of people now want to see action on climate change. With green technologies becoming more affordable, we have many of the tools needed to make a difference. To help us explore these challenges, I am joined by our first guest, Fiona Macklin, Senior Advisor to Groundswell, an initiative dedicated to amplifying stubborn climate optimism, a mission that CCAG is proud to support. Fiona, welcome.
Hello, Ade. Thank you so much for having me.
Fiona, can you tell us more about Groundswell and what fuels your stubborn optimism that we can still achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and keep global warming below 1.5 degrees?
Thank you so much. And thank you to CCAG. Congratulations for the brilliant report. It's great to be here. And Groundswell is a project that is born out of global optimism under the leadership of Christiana Figueres and Tom Karnak. And it's really essentially a response to the horrendous doomism that we are seeing in the media and in the climate narrative. And it feels like over the last couple of years and a bit more, we're really losing the narrative battle on climate. It was something like 74% of articles last summer across the UK and the US fed a climate doomist narrative. And obviously, Ade, as you've mentioned, there is a reason to be outraged. There are worse droughts that we're seeing on record in Brazil, the worst hurricanes that we're seeing, Hurricane Beryl, on record ever. So we are way off track, but giving up isn't an option. And I've come at this from previously rowing a lot. And in rowing as a sport, we used to go into races as an underdog. And it was only with a mindset of sort of dedication and determination that we could flip that result around and win races. So what's helping me with this stubborn optimism and maintain it is really an understanding that there is a possibility to still change course because change is underway. Fossil fuel demand in the private sector is falling in half of the world's economies. Clean energy investment is surging. I think, in fact, clean energy technologies investment overtook fossil fuel investment by nearly 70% last year. and every nation has agreed to halt deforestation. So we're seeing these pockets of changes, and what needs to happen is those signals of change need to be massively scaled. And what we're doing with Groundswell through a collective mission 2025, including with partners like CCAG, is start to build out this chorus of voices signaling this positive change and showing up to governments, really demonstrating their appetite to collaborate on delivering the change that is required.
I mean, it's really important that we have someone like you, Fiona, that is giving out this positive information, because you're right, it can be lost in this fog of doom and gloom. So no, thank you for that. Look, one of the critical issues highlighted in CCAG's new report is the responsibility of wealthy nations whose growth has been powered by fossil fuels. Now, to support vulnerable nations and vulnerable developing countries, it's really important that we understand how these wealthy nations support them, and how does Groundswell's work address the issues of equity and justice in the context of climate change. I mean, equity and justice is huge if we are going to solve this problem, isn't it, Fiona?
Thank you. It's fundamental, and I couldn't agree more with you about the challenge and the responsibility of major emitters to really lead the transition in terms of mitigating emissions and financing a successful transition. I think what we're doing with Groundswell is perhaps twofold, but also continuously inviting advice and recommendations for how we can improve this. On the one hand, I think what's really crucially important is listening and understanding what these nations and the communities, the stakeholders in emerging and developing economies need, both in terms of the actual outcomes, but also what they need to hear around them in terms of inspiring stories that can help drive change. It's been really interesting, Ade. We've been doing a lot of work with partners in the data community who are helping to provide evidence on the insights of exponential change underway, which is fantastic and really important. But many communities in other regions of the world don't resonate with that sort of technological exponential change. They want to hear about communities having access to power in their small towns across Africa or Indonesia. And so we're really trying to understand how we also tell those stories across many different regions of the world. But I also think, coming back to the first point that you made in the question, we need to place the emphasis of the responsibility on major emitters. And so a lot of what we're doing with Groundswell is empowering the leaders in those major emitting countries to step up and step forwards and really demonstrate that their expectations are on their own leaders to lead this transition and finance development. And I would just say, it's been really inspiring. This morning, I was at David Lammy's first set speech on foreign policy, and it was really energizing to hear him speak about the importance of supporting the development of nations abroad, and in particular through climate finance, and really holding that responsibility as a developed economy. So I really hope that we can crowd in behind that type of leadership and signal that as the way forwards to replicate from a lot of other developed economies.
I think David Lammy must have been listening when I phoned into his radio show on LBC and had a real go about climate change and the lack of action and incrementalization of governments, the slow movement. But no, it's positive. Just one quick question, actually. When you talk about empowering leaders, what does that entail?
It's a really good question, and actually perhaps I would use emboldening a little bit more, because I think what we need is we need more noise around the appetite for the change. You mentioned, I think, in your introduction that something like 80% of people around the world want their governments to act on climate. I don't think we're hearing that loudly enough. And so one of the things that we're really trying to do through this Mission 2025 is amp up the volume from private sector leaders, from businesses, from investors, from citizens, from real economy leaders, to say, look, we want you to drive this change and we stand ready to help invest in this transition. And so I think it's through that louder noise, and both through public and private channels, that we can help government leaders feel emboldened to take the steps and implement the policies that they need to accelerate this transition.
Thank you, Fiona. Keep emboldening government leaders and please stay stubbornly optimistic. Love the positivity. That was brilliant. We're going to move on to our next guest, and that's CCAG member Alice Hill. We want to turn to the situation in the United States. It's a nation often seen as both a leader and a laggard in the fight against climate change. Now, Alice Hill was an advisor to President Obama and is a leading expert on climate risk and resilience. Alice, as the CCAG report makes clear, powerful vested interests continue to obstruct meaningful climate action. So, how do you see these competing forces playing out in the US? And is there enough political will to overcome these roadblocks and implement the kind of transformative change that the CCAG report calls for?
Well, great question. And I think it was a wonderful report. The issue really is political will, which has been the issue for decades now. One of the bellwethers here is our fight over ESG, which sustainability efforts in Europe are taken as a given. But in the United States, we're still fighting over very vociferously whether ESG is even a factor that should be considered by companies or by our federal government. And that just reflects how dug in, particularly the Republican side, is on fighting progress on environmental issues that relate to our energy and our dependence on oil for our economy, as well as for our ability to power ourselves and transport ourselves.
Alice, thank you very much. We may come back to you a little bit later because there are a few more things I'd like to talk to you about if we have time. But thank you so much. First of all, welcome to both of you. Look, as we grapple with these structural challenges, younger generations around the world are stepping up, refusing to wait for change, which is a great thing. And that brings me to our guest, Zainab Bie, a 20-year-old climate finance advocate from India, and Kamila Camilo, a social entrepreneur and advocate from Brazil. So Zainab, at just 20, you have already made significant strides in raising awareness about climate change, particularly among young people in India. So can you speak to me as to what it's like to witness the impacts of climate change in India firsthand and how this has driven your policy and advocacy work?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. Living here in Delhi, India, I've been witnessing the heat waves directly. It's been the past 4 to 5 years wherein there have been instances of excessive heat. This year, India faced 121 of direct days of heat waves. That's a lot for all of us. Children are unable to go to school. People are preferred to stay inside, stay indoors, and it is affecting our day-to-day lives to a lot of extent. Growing up, I have always seen those pictures of women who are walking for 7 to 8 hours to go and get water for their families. I didn't realize why this is happening and why this is really part of our culture and why is it as such. Now realizing that how important it is that climate change is affecting us directly, those 7 to 8 hours of the day are lost. Those days by those hours that are spent by women just to get waters for their family, which is just like a basic necessity for everyone, and they're spending those important hours instead of going to school. So realizing that climate action and climate change is not just a not just a climate justice issue, but also a social justice issue. It is affecting our day-to-day necessities and our light and our right to live. So these are some of the issues that really affected me. And in fact, the issues related to water scarcity. India has a population of around 1.4 billion people, and we just have around 4 to 5% of the entire freshwater system within the world, which is really less compared to the amount of people we have. And 70% of the water resources that India have are contaminated to a lot of extent because we do not have the right resources to get them right. So when I actually went to COP27, I realized that these issues that are part of our day-to-day life that have affected our lives in such an important way are not really presented well within these decision-making spaces. And in fact, the aspect of urgency wasn't present in these spaces. And this is what really led me to make sure that the youth become the beacon of hope and make sure that youth voice their concerns, because we really do not want to be a generation that inherits the climate change, that inherits the climate crisis, but we also want to contribute as much as we could. And that's how everything started, and I took up the lead in awareing people and advocating for climate justice.
Thank you so much, Zainab. Just a quick question on that and the youth in India. How politically aware are they and active are they? You know, and how much influence could they have on politics and the kind of leaders that you have in India?
So for us, we usually have a regular bilateral meetings with our governments, and we are politically connected, and youth is politically active. But the question that wherein we end up stopping is when the government tells us that we do not have the funds to finance the energy transition, and that is quite correct, because even though climate change is a problem that will end the world, poverty is a problem that is that will lead to end of the month. So it's a problem that India is facing much more important issues right now. We need to divert our funding and our budget to more important stuff, and that is a very accurate the point from the government side. And this is where in we decided to take a lead and advocate for more climate finance at the global stages so that we get the funds for energy transition. So, yes, we do have the political capacity. Yes, we are politically active, but we know our limited capacity and constraint that India is facing.
Thank you, Zainab. That was really illuminating. So really enjoyed listening to you there. Let's move to Camilla next. So Camilla, your work focuses on bridging the gap between grassroots initiatives and larger institutions in tackling social and environmental challenges in Brazil. So Brazil's rainforests, we all know, play a crucial role in the global climate system, but they're also threatened by deforestation. So, how do you navigate the complex issues in your work? And how can we better support the local communities most impacted by climate change in Brazil and beyond?
Thank you, Wade, for having me. It's really an honor to be here with you all. We have two aspects in our work. The first one is raise awareness with every stakeholder to hold them accountable of their actions, especially on the business side, because they are eager for the results, the financial results that the forest can give them, but they are not with the same willingness to make the change for the communities. But the second part is co-design. Something that I've been seeing is like everything we build, every solution we build together with the local communities, we are far away more like in a possibility to have success because they know where the problem really is. One thing that I noticed was like in one of the villages that we work with, we went there with like a bunch of equipment, drones, recording devices to monitoring biodiversity. And one thing that the community leader told us was, thank you for coming and looking below the canopies. We missed the opportunity to look at below the canopy. The companies are looking above because they want the carbon, they want what the forest can give them, but they don't want the people, right? So we navigate these challenges by co-designing the solutions and actually being on the ground. We cannot make decisions about the Amazon rainforest without being there, right? We are so far of our essence with nature that we do things thinking that it will work. We actually are developing nature-based solutions without being in nature for sure, right? So what I try to do to navigate those aspects is actually bringing people to the communities, invite them to be with the communities. We develop learning journey trips so people can be on the ground co-designing solutions. They can work together for a while, and then we continue the exchange programs online, kind of thing we do together.
Kamila was making some really interesting points about listening to the local community and about doing, when you make this transition, the transition has got to be together with the local communities. It's not going to be apart from them. And that's one of the huge mistakes we've been making when we've been trying to tackle climate change. So let me move to one of our two experts with deep knowledge of Brazil and complex relationship with Brazil's complex relationship with climate change. So I want to welcome, first of all, Professor Mercedes Bustamante, and then we'll speak afterwards to environmentalist and biologist Carlos Rittl. Mercedes, Brazil must find a delicate balance between economic development, social equity, and environmental protection. Could you elaborate on what a holistic solution to this challenge might look like? And this is a really difficult question, but a very important question, Mercedes.
Yeah, thank you, Ade. Nice to be back. It's hard to speak after Kamila, I have to say that. It's quite nice to hear such a young voice with profound and strong ideas. Yeah, this is a quite important issue, Ade, and I think it's not just related to Brazil, but related to most of the global South. And thinking about what Fiona was saying, how we need to change the narrative, I think this is one of the narratives that we need to change, that climate change action and development are in opposite sides. Yeah. I think we need to deconstruct this narrative and saying that really robust and strong climate action is part of the development pathway for global South countries. And we need to also to consider that climate change is already affecting Brazil, is already affecting our economy. We are having this year strong extreme events. We have the floods in South Brazil. We now have a severe drought that is affecting the north part of Brazil, the central part of Brazil, with huge wildfires. Brasilia, the cities where I am right now, is covered with smoke and air pollution that is also affecting human health. So we need to consider that Brazilian people are already experiencing the consequences of greenhouse gas emissions that are globally continue to rise. So without climate action, all these consequences will aggravate, and the poorest and the most vulnerable people will be affected the most. And this is also have impacts on our economies. Yesterday, one of the Supreme Court judges in Brazil demanded the Brazilian government to have an extraordinary budget to deal with all the consequences of the extreme events. So this is already part of our economy. Mm. So we need to say that if implemented well, climate action could unlock inclusivity, development, and growth. So we have affordable, scalable solutions that was mentioned here. 2 scientific papers that were published this year. They are bringing 2 very good news. First one, conservation works. So this is a really global comparison that is quite important. The second scientific paper was about the analysis of climate policies. It's a huge analysis and saying there is a menu of policies that we can implement and then really can deliver the climate goals that we need. So what we need, as mentioned here before by Fiona and by Alice, is scale and political will. And just to finish, because I know that Carlos has much more to say than I have, we need also to consider that climate change is still a global challenge. So emissions anywhere will affect people everywhere. So, and this really requires coordination, cooperation at international level, so that we can keep and help developing countries to move towards a low carbon economy. So we need to work by ourselves, but we also need this international cooperation more than ever. Thank you, Ade.
No, thank you, Mercedes. Always really interesting and fascinating to hear from you. You know, changing the narrative, I think that's such a key aspect to this, you know, for people to understand that action against climate change is progress. It's not a regression. It is progress. We are moving forward. And I really love that idea. And it's something that I'm going to keep in my head constantly, to go out there and keep trying to change the narrative and show people that moving forward and tackling our climate crisis are two things that are intrinsically linked. I'm going to move on to Carlos next. And Carlos, from your perspective, how can Brazil overcome the political and economic barriers that often stand in the way of the transformative change that is needed?
Well, thanks a lot. First of all, it's my challenge is bigger than Mercedes because I'm speaking after her and after Kamila. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and thanks a lot for inviting me. This is such an important discussion. As segue for part of what Mercedes just mentioned, I think Brazil is in a unique position to show that climate should be a development priority. Now we are seeing that again, the climate change goes against those who are the most socially vulnerable, and this is happening. We have more than 1,800 cities in Brazil that are under extreme or severe drought right now. As Mercedes pointed out, we had the floods in the southern Brazil in late April and May, more than 200 people dying, and the cost of reconstruction, if this is something possible, it's more over $20 billion as estimated. Right now, Brazil has the presidency of G20, and next year it's the president of COP. So let's help Brazil addressing these own contradictions and ensuring that by next year we deliver the outcomes in an unprecedented way when the climate COP goes back home. Let's remember, the Rio Conventions, include the one on climate, was born in Brazil in Rio in 1992. And now, for the first time, a climate COP is going to happen in the Amazon region. It's absolutely a unique opportunity for us to face all these challenges all together and as a global community to completely change the paths forward. Thanks a lot.
That's a really, really great point there, Carlos. You know, that COP is coming to the Amazon, you know, the heart of where a lot of the issues are. Something else that I've taken from what you spoke about is, and it's a message that we should all understand, is that the impact of climate change is an amplifier. So whatever your position, you know, if you're dealing with poverty, climate change will amplify the acuteness of that problem. If you're facing problems with, you know, the disability discrimination, all of that, climate change amplifies it. It adds to it. And that's a reason why we have to deal with this. You know, everyone who is struggling, if you're struggling now, if we don't tackle climate change, that's only going to be amplified even more, you know, and your problem is going to become even more acute. So we have to understand and we have to take action. Thank you so much, Mercedes and Carlos. I'd like to get the thoughts of a giant in the CCAG, and that's our founder member and former chief scientific advisor to the UK government, Sir David King. Sir David, welcome, first of all. Our guests so far have highlighted a growing movement that demands climate action. They've also spoken about the complex political and economic challenges that we must solve if we're going to progress. Now, in your view, what role can shifting public attitudes, particularly amongst young people, play in driving the policy changes needed to address this crisis effectively?
Thank you very much, Ade. I think the biggest answer to your question is that we're talking about democracies. And in a democracy, public opinion should hold sway. That's what a democracy is all about. And so it is critically important, not only that we listen to young people, that we listen to all the people. I was discussion about and listening to them. But we also have to take into account the bigger interests in a given country. So Brazil has a whole range of economic interests, and we need to reflect on those interests and see that we take those people along with us as well. So when we're talking about public opinion, we need to understand that the world is in a very challenging situation. And many of us believe that it is quite possible that humanity, as we know it today and as it has developed over thousands of years, that humanity is faced with an enormous crisis, a crisis of a kind it has never had to face up to before. And if we acknowledge that, and if we can get that message through, and the message is we can manage it. We can manage it. And here, Fiona Macklin from Groundswell, I wouldn't want to gainsay a word that she said. We know that we can manage this crisis, but what it needs is a real groundswell around the world to back up what the knowledge we have that we can manage the problem. So I think, yes, we need people to understand what the young people like Zainab and Kamila are saying. We also need to understand what people like Mercedes Bustamante, another CCAG member, is saying, and other senior colleagues. So it's all got to be put together. I think the biggest challenge of all is from the oil-rich countries, because those are the countries where a big challenge comes from. Now, interestingly, we haven't mentioned that Brazil has got its own oil, and this it didn't have 25 years ago. So this is a fairly recent development in Brazil, and it's a nationalized oil industry. And so the Prime Minister is trying to balance the books of the country, the GDP growth, and his real commitment to action on climate change, because he knows, and in South Brazil, they've had massive challenges from floods and massive loss of life, but in particular, loss of an enormous city over a period of time from flooding. The Brazilians fully understand the challenges of climate change, but we all need to come on board with this challenge of bringing the policymakers who have all these broader concerns to face up to this biggest challenge we have ever had to face up to. And these policymakers include those in the oil-rich countries. Which oil-rich country have we got on board? It's the United States of America, now producing more oil than any other country has ever produced. Now, what we need to do is to see that all countries lead towards a massive fall in the carbon dioxide emissions and methane emissions that are currently occurring. And that is a very big challenge that needs all of us to do the best we can.
It seems to me that, thank you, Sir Dave, that we really need, the work needs to be done on the oil-rich nations. They're the ones who hold the key, drop in their oil production and they will lead the way. Because I feel at the moment, people feel, or most people see, the only way out of poverty and the only way for progress is through oil. And that is part of this whole changing the narrative that we're talking about. You know, we have to find a way to change the narrative. And that goes through the US, the Arab Emirates, China, these oil rich nations.
And what it requires, Ade, is that governments understand that if they simply let the economic system run forward, it's not going to manage the situation. Time is not on our side. We need proper regulatory systems introduced. So, for example, electric vehicles. We need to see that electric vehicles replace all combustion-driven vehicles on the roads of the world. And that will only happen in time if we get proper legislation saying, after this point in time, we will not have any further new combustion-driven vehicles on our roads. That is the way forward. If we leave it to the marketplace, this will just go on and on. And that is a big challenge, introducing regulatory behavior which is seen to be operating against the free market system. Now, I'm just going to say that free market system is a big part of our problem. And we need to really examine what the alternative economic model is that delivers a safe world for all of us, but it also delivers much better equity as we go forward in time. If I look around the world, I see that in many African countries, the amount of emissions per person is 0.2, 0.5 tons per person per annum. In the United States, 17.5 tons per person per annum. Now, that must surely mean that the United States has to move quickly from this point on to cut off its dependence on fossil fuels. That's a very big challenge.
Yeah, really, really important point there. So, David, thank you so much. To ensure a livable future, it's clear we need a global energy transition, as Sir Dave was alluding to. Finally, closing the door on fossil fuels and embracing renewables. But what does this transition look like on the ground, particularly in a rapidly developing nation like India? So I'd like to turn now to Ganesh Hegde, a postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University and the Lingers Center of Energy and the Environment. Ganesh, welcome to the show. Ganesh, your research focuses on mapping our pathways for India to embrace renewable energy. Now, could you elaborate on the specific obstacles and opportunities you've identified in your work? Welcome, Ganesh, by the way.
Thank you, Ade. Thank you for having me. It's always nice to be part of this rich discussion here. So we are trying to identify what are some of the technological and socioeconomic pathways for India to reach net zero emissions by 2070. So I understand that this is a pretty long horizon, and the uncertainties and consequences of decisions that we make today, whether it is political, economic, or technological, will have long-term consequences.
You're talking about over 40 years away, though, aren't you?
We are talking about over 40 years. But then the study also explores some of the decisions that we may have to take right now, which otherwise will not give any more options in the future. Mm-hmm. So that's the overall kind of agenda of this study, which was adopted from the influential Net Zero America framework. As we rightly discussed, India is facing two important challenges, and also some of this is an opportunity space. So the uncertainties in developmental policies or developmental outcomes for the next decade or so has a huge consequence and impact on what mitigation pathways that we could take. India heavily relies on coal-based electricity so far, but then there is also a huge policy push, and unlike in some countries, Indian government, both at the federal and the state level, is on board to aggressively push for renewable-based energy technologies. But it also comes with a huge challenge in terms of natural resources. The country which has probably the highest population today also has a competing natural resource for housing, for agriculture, and all other activities. So what we identified, or at least what we're trying to see, is how this kind of fragmented candidate project sites or project areas could be best utilized for renewable energy projects in the future. And it also provides some kind of a space for policy innovation, space for technological innovations. Instead of going through large solar parks, you can have more decentralized versions, which also opens up a lot of avenues to address how do we involve communities, how do we address social justice, environmental justice issues at the local level. So this is a challenge, but this is also an opportunity space for us to work with.
It's fascinating, you know, when you map out this pathway and give us a better understanding, because I think that's one of the things, you know, I hear a lot from people in the UK is they talk about other nations, you know, what are they doing when it comes to climate change. So I think it's really important that we understand what India is doing, and especially in light of the fact that, you know, with your population and your location, you are right on the front line, you know, with the Himalayas there looming in the background, you know, you are on the front line of climate change. But look, there's also look, there's no denying that the developed nations, you know, that we've talked about with their historical responsibility for carbon emissions, it's no denying that they should play a greater role in supporting countries like India to the transition into renewable energy. And from your research, what form should this support take? You know, financial, technological, or otherwise, in order to actually have a proper impact?
Look, there is no more evidence needed for any of these discussions that developed countries have to play a lot more significant role, both in technological space and definitely in providing some kind of upfront capital, low cost capital, or assistance for technology space, or innovating technology. So that's kind of well established. But our research is somewhat much deeper into these things. One of the things we strive to try is how developed countries can lead by example, right? So how do they actually solve, or how do they actually deal with issues around community acceptance, issues around socio-political resistance towards some of the renewables or some of the newer technologies? How do they actually deal with all these issues? If they can provide some kind of a framework to address that, a lot of developing countries could leapfrog. One thing that happened in the market, free market space, is on the efficiency revolution. Most of the developing countries or low-income countries now could leapfrog in terms of having LEDs in their houses and access to these LEDs in the markets, which is also happening with the EV space, at least in India and mostly in China. You have a lot of two-wheeler EVs and three-wheeler EVs are being penetrated into the market, and people are using that. But that also requires somewhat of orderly transition, in the sense, if you have more and more EV and your generation is not clean, then that's only going to increase emission at the source level. So these are some of the nuances that developed countries could handle and could lead by examples.
Thank you for that. That was really interesting, Ganesh, to give us that sort of a more effective route, and it'd be interesting to understand what sort of communication that the developed nations, how the UK and India communicate, and how much the talks of climate change, how big a part that plays in their conversations. Because I think it should be front and center, absolutely front and center. But yeah, once again, Ganesh, thank you so much, and thank you to all of our guests for your contributions. You've been absolutely perfect, exactly what we need. Now, as we've heard today, tackling climate change requires a multifaceted approach to solve a multifaceted problem. It demands not just technological innovation, but also a transformation in our political systems and economic priorities. This might seem like a daunting task, but the alternative, inaction, is far more dangerous. Extreme weather events, faltering food systems, and the signs of ecological collapse remind us that every fraction of a degree of warming matters, and the decisions we make today will have a profound and lasting consequences for generations to come. Look, I'd like to thank all of our guests for joining us today and for sharing their valuable insights on this critical issue. And as we wrap today's episode, we encourage you to join the movement. Our movement is nothing without you and without your support and your engagement. So please learn more, share what you've heard today, and explore ways to be a part of the solution. Until next time, goodbye.